easier in the cloud.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the February CTCFT. This is the first one we've had in a few months, the first one of 2022. And so I just want to say welcome back to having this opportunity to have talks between different teams for Rust and share some of the stuff that we're working on more internally. And so just as a reminder, I do want to say that we're going to have a decent amount of time for questions today. And so if you're attending live and you're interested in asking a question for either of our talks, then you can just put your hand up like this in the question in the chat, and then we'll add you to the queue. Also, just a reminder to mute yourself and turn off the video unless you're the one queued up to speak. And so to get us started here, we have a bit of a smaller agenda today with different content and stuff like that. But I think this will give us a good opportunity to potentially ask a lot of questions. And so we have the Rust 2021 survey results. And so Nick's going to give us an update on that. We also have Wesley and potentially Felix giving us an update on the compiler team ambitions for 2022. And so the theme of the CTCFT is planning for 2022. And so kind of just exploring what kind of stuff we have coming up for the next year, which I think is a pretty nice theme to start out the year with. Afterwards, as always, we'll have our 60-minute social hour. It might be a bit longer today, depending on when we get started with it, when we finish the talks today. We'll have, I forget if we normally have the announcement or like open mic at the closing of the CTCFT or right now. But I'll put it at the end for this month. And then if anybody has any announcements that they'd quickly like to shout out, we can do that right at the end. So without further ado, I will pass it over to you, Nick, and we can get started on the survey results.
Hey, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the survey. So we've been doing an annual survey of the Rust community kind of every year for a while now. I don't even remember how many years, but it's quite a few. Last year, Ryan and I decided to give the survey a little bit of an overhaul. So we've kept around some of the kind of old favorite questions, but we've polished a few questions. We added a bunch more. So it was a bit different in 2021 compared to the previous few years. So thank you everyone who filled it out. Lots of people did. We had just over 9,000 complete responses, which is a new record. And I think around 12,000 kind of partial responses. So a lot of people filled it out. So thanks very much. And thanks also to, for the folk who helped translate the questions and have been translating the answers, and also to a bunch of folk who gave some really good input while we were kind of working on the overhaul of the survey. So most of the rest of this slot, I'm just going to like talk about some of the results. As Forrest has popped up, we got the blog post that came out last week, and that has a summary of some of the results and is worth giving a read if you haven't already. I'm going to probably repeat some of those and talk about a few more. Exactly what we're going to share kind of like more long-term is still being decided. If you have opinions about that, then there's a kind of policy proposal on the survey repo. I can post a link to that PR later if people are interested in that. But probably the next step is we're going to try and put together a kind of summary report that captures pretty much all of the results, but without too much analysis, and we'll send that at least to everybody on a Rust team, so that that can hopefully help with your planning and thinking for the year. I'd like to make as much public as we can as well, but we're still kind of like talking about that, and then a bit later in the year we're going to try and do some kind of like deeper analysis on the results. So if there's anything that the Rust teams or working groups would like to know, then please let me know, and we can kind of like work that into that kind of like deeper analysis that we're planning to do a bit later on. Okay, so, well, I already said we got like 9,000 responses. Of those, like 90% were Rust users. We do ask for kind of non-users and former users to fill out as well, but they're usually in a minority. Of those Rust users, we tend to see a lot using Rust at work. So this year, 40% of people said that they use Rust a lot at work. So that's either as their kind of like main language or sole language. And another 19% said they use it a bit, and 41% said they don't use it. And this is one that's a bit hard to compare to previous years because we asked a slightly different question. I don't have like previous year's data to hand anyway. But people always ask like how that compares to previous years. For now and for this talk, I'm just going to focus on what we got this year. So I wanted to start off with just some kind of feel-good statistics, really. We asked a couple of different questions about kind of like sentiment kind of questions, whether you agree with these statements. So only 1% of respondents felt that programming with Rust was not fun. So I like that like makes me happy as a statistic. Even fewer, just 0.25% thought that Rust was not beneficial. And another small number, only 1%, said that the benefits were not worth the challenges of using Rust. And when we asked about whether people were using Rust for projects at work, 90% of people who have done so would use Rust again, or sorry, are likely to use Rust again in the future. So those are the kind of statistics that we want to track year on year into the future, but they make me happy for this year so far. So why do people use Rust? So I think these answers kind of they're not surprising, but they confirm our kind of like assumptions that we make, really. So 96% of people use it for correctness and to produce because it helps them produce bug-free software. 94% for performance, 89% for security, and 89% for fun. I guess that last one is maybe a little bit interesting. Like the numbers are up there with the kind of strong technical reasons. 74% use it because they want like precise control over what their machine is doing. Sorry, these there's not much of a narrative. I'm kind of just reading numbers out, so I'm going to kind of like hop over to the next topic, which is where people are developing software. Again, this is not particularly surprising, but kind of confirms the kind of assumptions we make. 70% of people develop on Linux, another 31% on Windows, and 32% on Mac. So that's kind of like a strong majority for Linux. And I think it's interesting that Windows and Mac users have about equal numbers. Where people target, so where Rust is running, again, kind of 80% on Linux, 39% on Windows, and one that was really surprising was a full 24% are targeting WebAssembly as a target. So this was a multiple choice question, and lots of people ticked lots of boxes, and I think this is one place where kind of like a deeper analysis of that is going to be really interesting, because I'm pretty sure that there aren't a quarter of all Rust developers targeting just WebAssembly. But even so, that's I think an interesting statistic. Okay, so we've had over the years kind of like quite an interest in what version of the toolchain people are using. So 91% of people are using a stable toolchain, 36% are using nightly, and only 3% are using something else. So you'll notice numbers don't add up to 100. That's because it's multiple choice questions. But yeah, it's about 3 times as many people using stable as nightly. And as for why people are using nightly, so 72% it's for features, either a specific feature or for all the features that come with nightly. And that's like the overwhelming reason people are using nightly is for new features. But then the next most important reason, 24% of respondents use nightly because a dependency requires it, and 20% because a tool requires it. 11% use it because they test it in CI. So I don't have like previous numbers. It's interesting to see how we're tracking in terms of how many people are using kind of like stable versus a nightly tool chain, and that analysis will come later. And a similar measure, I think, kind of like we ask questions about stability as well. So just about the stable compiler, I think we got really good numbers here. Only 2% worry about their code breaking when they update their stable compiler. And obviously we have our backwards compatibility promise, but that's working. Like people do not worry about upgrading their compiler version, and or their stable compiler version. I think that's really great. Even fewer, just 1.5%, feel that they sometimes have to make non-trivial changes to their code when they upgrade their compiler. So yeah, that's again something that I feel is quite positive. Okay, so so kind of like making a little leap again, like one area that kind of like I've always been kind of like keen on pushing in Rust is tooling, and I think kind of the survey is a really great opportunity to get information about which tools people are using and how they're using them. I think this year kind of like two areas that kind of like stood out to me were IDEs and debuggers. So we asked people how they edit their code, and again, multiple choice question, people take more than one, but 77% of people use an IDE of some kind. That's a lot, like more than I would have guessed. 40% of people use kind of like a more basic text editor. So I feel like that's probably a change compared to a few years ago. Of the IDE folk, sorry, not of the IDE, of all users, the most popular IDE was VS Code, with 60% of users using it at least some of the time, versus about 27% prefer kind of a more kind of like traditional full-featured kind of IDE. And in terms of kind of sentiment, like 66% of people have a positive impression of IDE support in Rust, which is, I think, pretty great, compared to 28% having a negative impact, and 56% think that it got better in the last year. So I think that's kind of really impressive. And shout out to everyone kind of who's worked on Rust Analyzer, RLS, JetBrains, etc. for doing that good work. Debugging is interesting. I think it's interesting whether debuggers are kind of like traditionally a really essential tool for systems programmers, and there's kind of like a bit of a feeling that in Rust you don't need one so much. So I was interested to see like whether the statistics back that up. So 65% of people use some debugger some of the time. So that means obviously like 35% of people never use a debugger. I thought fewer people would be using a debugger, to be honest, but that's pretty interesting to me. And in comparison, 68% of people do debugging using some kind of logging, whether that's print line or using the debug macro or using something more formal like a tracing library or whatever. So they're kind of comparable numbers. So that's like 65% use some kind of debugger compared to 68% do some kind of logging to debug their problems. On the other hand, only 41% of people have a positive impression of debugging, and 38% of people have a negative impression. And only 21% of people think it got better over the last year. And so those numbers don't seem quite so bad, but it turns out kind of like people who fill out the Rust survey are quite nice. And certainly in comparison to kind of like the sentiment that we saw for other parts of that question, like that kind of 41%, 38% split is fairly negative for debugging. Okay, so talking of kind of like this kind of like sentiment about things, I wanted to kind of like quickly go over kind of some of the percentages of people who had kind of like positive sentiment about stuff, because I think this is kind of good to know. So kind of most positive impressions were about documentation and compiler error messages, both of which had like 90% of people thought they were good. In comparison, on the compiler, nobody will be surprised that compile times got a pretty measly score of 36%. But on the other hand, compiler errors, so that's like ICEs, had a 73% kind of positive impression, which is pretty good. We didn't ask about many kind of like domains of programming. We probably should have asked some more. We did ask about async programming, which only got 39%, and GUI programming, which only got 5% positive impressions. But that's probably not too surprising either, given the state of kind of like GUI programming in Rust. So I'm just kind of seeing where we got up to. Okay, so one of the really interesting questions that we asked, and this was a suggestion from Nell from the foundation and at Microsoft. So she suggested asking like what people's biggest worry was for the future of Rust, or what things worry. So this was again like a multiple choice question, so people could tick more than one, so don't expect the numbers to add up to 100. The most popular worry was that there was not enough industry usage of Rust, and that was at 38%. And given kind of like how positive 2021 has been in that direction, I would expect that number to kind of like be falling from previous years and fall in the future as well. The next biggest worry was that the language would get too complex, and 33% of our respondents had, of the Rust users who filled the survey had that worry, followed by 30% worried that developers on the project weren't getting the support that they needed. And 26% of people were not worried about anything at all. So that's the nice number. And every other worry, there were a few that we listed got less than that not worried number. Okay, so the final number I wanted to share was about, we asked quite a lot of information about developers' kind of experience and about who they are, I guess. Kind of we'll get deeper into that in the data we share later on. But for today, the bit I wanted to share was about people's experience with other programming languages, so where they've come from. So we asked whether people had any, whether they had no experience, or whether some, a lot, or experts. So just to make that into one number, I'm kind of like taking the expert or kind of like a decent amount of experience and bucketing them together. So the most popular kind of, so this year we changed slightly from previous years. We previously asked about individual programming languages. This year we asked about kind of like classes of programming languages or paradigms. So the most popular was dynamic programming languages. So this is or scripting languages, so JavaScript, Ruby, Python, that kind of thing. 83% of our users have decent experience with those languages. Next up was kind of your classic statically typed languages. So this is your Java, C#, Go, 72% there. And then C and C++ was is kind of like the or traditional systems programming languages is kind of like a fair ways down from that at 58%. And then kind of modern languages with kind of serious type systems. So this is like Scala, Kotlin, and Swift. That's 24%. And functional language, statically typed functional languages like Haskell was 17%. And dynamically typed functional languages like Lisp was even fewer at just 13%. So I think it's helpful to understand kind of like the backgrounds of where kind of like Rust users are coming from. And I think it's really interesting that you know, the kind of like the nearest languages, or the languages that maybe have kind of like a lot of influence on Rust actually have fairly low numbers of people overlapping, whereas the much more mainstream, more popular languages, perhaps unsurprisingly when you frame it like that, have much kind of like higher numbers of overlap. Okay, so that's all the numbers. Hopefully I haven't bored everyone to death. Like I say, there'll be kind of like a summary report for team members, hopefully soon. We don't have any kind of like firm date yet. But what would be really useful to know, both for the analysis that we'll be doing this year and also for planning the survey, you know, at the end of this year and in future years, is what you'd like to know. Like as a team, as a working group, what would you like to know about Rust users? Oh, sorry, I should say, like we're not just constrained to the kind of like the annual community survey as well. Like it might be interesting to do other kinds of surveys. So what we'd like to know is what you would like to know. And if we can figure that out from the data this year, then we'll try and get you an answer. And if we can't, then that's really good feedback for us for next year's, well, this year's survey, and future years surveys. So please let me know, or Brian and I know, if you have any of that kind of feedback. So yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Great. So I think we have a little bit of time here to do a question period. Nico, I'll hand it over to you first. It looks like you have your hand up.
Do I have a question? Nick, I'm curious, did you cross-reference the backgrounds that people came from with anything else, like their biggest worries, or like why they use Rust, or so forth?
So we have not done any of that kind of like deeper analysis yet. And, you know, deep is relative, and I realize that's not super deep, but like we haven't done any kind of like cross-referencing. We haven't really dived into the data beyond just trying to get kind of like the basic numbers at this stage. So I think that's kind of like that kind of cross-referencing is super interesting. We would, you know, there's obviously a lot of different cross-referencing you can do and kind of like with a, you know, data of this size. So it'd be really interesting to know like specifically what like folk are interested in, like particularly like interesting because it's actionable for teams planning or whatever, not just interesting because it's, I don't know, like interesting. But yeah, so if there's like specific things, I'd be really keen to hear what it is you want to do, and we'll try and work that into the actual analysis of the data we're planning to do.
The other question I had was whether you asked about the sort of domain that people are targeting when they write Rust, like embedded versus async versus whatever.
We did. I thought that would be an interesting thing to say today, but it's actually kind of difficult to interpret because there's a lot of overlapping areas. So sorry, I'm just kind of looking at the numbers I
We can dig into it offline.
Yeah.
Later,
So basically, it's kind of the largest domains that people are working in were basically kind of like the kind of web backend, networking, cloud infrastructure, that kind of group of domains. We asked about, it was a multiple choice question. We asked about so many different ones that it's actually kind of hard to compare. So for example, we asked about embedded with an operating system and without. So maybe if we combine those two, then it'll be, you know, higher up the list than it looks at the moment. But maybe it won't because it's multiple choice and maybe everybody's already ticked both of those. So it's one of those questions where even to kind of like get the simple answers takes a bit of analysis. But that's certainly one of the ones that I plan to kind of like dig into a little bit for the initial summary data that we're gonna send out.
Okay. Yeah, I'll cede the floor to Josh, but I'll just note before I go that I think it's really good to focus on what will you do in response to the data. I like that, but also that I think like with domains in particular, I would be interested to try to do some of that cross correlation because knowing, I think that does seem very actionable to me to know, for example, you know, people who are doing embedded have these specific concerns. Those same concerns, if they come from a different group of people, like might have different answers, you know, like embedded.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, Josh.
So I am thrilled to hear so many positive sentiments about Rust. I know many people are. The thought crosses my mind that like we try to reach people who are interested in answering the survey, but aren't necessarily involved in Rust or using Rust actively. But it's clear that like 90% of people who answer the survey are using Rust. So we are missing a substantial audience of people who, for example, try Rust and bounce off and aren't necessarily connected enough to the Rust community to go answer a survey about a language they don't currently use. Are there any plans or have there been any discussions for how we can make a concerted effort to reach and survey people who have bounced off of Rust, are waiting to try Rust because there's some blocker for them? Basically, the set of people that we are going to miss information from because they're not here yet, and that's a circular problem.
Yeah, so I don't think we've had kind of very many discussions about anything, to be honest. So kind of like part of the problem has been that the survey, or kind of like this broader kind of like area of understanding our users, really has not really been owned by anybody and has just been kind of ticking along over the years. And so Ryan and I have kind of like started with the annual survey to try and kind of get deeper into this area. Yeah, so absolutely kind of like understanding the users who bounce off is really important, but also kind of really difficult. And I think it's interesting that we get like 10% may not sound like very many, but that's like over 1,000 respondents who no longer use Rust filling out the survey. And I think that that's kind of the only data we have of anywhere near this kind of like scale about those users. And obviously far more than a folk who are kind of like fitting GitHub issues or whatever. But I think kind of like one thing we kind of struggled with was what exactly we wanted to kind of like ask those users. So yeah, I mean, I think that the survey is like the annual survey has like a bit more reach into those kind of like former users than any other tool we have at the moment. And so thinking about exactly what we want to ask them like in the following years would be really good to know. Beyond that, I think that kind of like it's important not to get too hung up on surveying. I think that like getting information about our users is super important. But often like a survey isn't the best way to do that. And especially with users, well, non-users who are hard to actually kind of like track down and get to take part, then we might get much more useful data by doing kind of like one-on-one interviews or focus groups or
Usability
any of the other
testing
kind of
by
like,
some principled fashion, yes.
yeah. So
Yeah,
obviously there's
I
kind
don't
of like
want to
issues with bias.
over-focus on the survey in that way. I just wanted to ask if there had been any thoughts of how to extend that reach or how to specifically reach those people. I'm thinking specifically of like, as we try to make the language more usable, I would love to make sure that we are hearing concerns from people who bounce off and don't come back, and not just people who bounce off lightly but are still close enough to know that the survey exists.
Right.
And
No, yeah, that's a
I
good
want to
point.
make sure that we're not consistently missing a particular class of user.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sounds like there are thoughts on that front, and also we
Yeah.
could do some
Yeah,
more.
there's definitely thoughts, but nothing concrete.
Okay, thanks. That was all I had.
All right. I don't think we have a few comments in chat here, but I will, I think, pass it over to Wesley now, and we can get started with the compiler team ambitions.
Would you mind pulling the slides up for us?
Yes, I can do that.
I'd just like to be able to look at my notes.
No worries. Let me just figure out where I put them. All right, here we go. Perfect.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so this talk is basically about an upcoming blog post that's getting published titled "Compiler Team Ambitions for 2022" by Felix and I, based on some planning we did. And so most of this talk is actually about kind of the meta pieces of that planning and not so much about the content of the blog post, but there is a sneak peek at the contents of the blog post at the end. So if you could go to the next slide. Yeah, so kind of the background here is just an observation that in previous years, the compiler team has often kind of oscillated between having planned out ahead of time plans for the year and processes to try to achieve those plans and working groups and things like that. And then other times things have just been very unplanned and ad hoc, and that's fine too. But for this year, we wanted to be a little bit more organized, and that's sort of in contrast to last year, which was very ad hoc, even though lots of really great stuff happened. So next slide. So part of the goals of our process here was a few simple things. One, we wanted to find out what contributors were actually working on. There's a lot of people in the compiler team, and especially in the compiler team contributors sub-team. And most of them are self-motivated to work on things. It's not really top-down. You know, Felix and I can't just come up with a list of things and tell people to go work on them. It's really what interests people and what they want to work on, and that sort of decides, you know, the different things they contribute. And it's not always clear to us what people are interested in working on or might want to work on, but aren't sure if, you know, there are other people that could support them working on those things or not. Kind of related to that, we wanted to see if there were common themes to those things that people want to work on between different sets of contributors. We were really hoping that there would be. Ideally, what we would like to do is spin up some working groups or project groups, or even if it's just, you know, one or two people, like try to get some people connected so that they know, you know, who's maybe interested in working on that same thing, who could they bounce ideas off of, who could they ask for code reviews, things like that. We wanted to give the community an idea what we're working on. The release team does a really great job showing off what's in every release that goes out, but I think it's not always obvious to the larger Rust community what might be coming, in the very short term or in kind of a more medium, over the course of 2022 kind of time frame. We wanted to highlight some of the ways that the community can help out, even though, like I said before, we kind of are a large team. We want to keep growing that team. We want to enable new people to contribute to the compiler. We want to grow people in the roles that they already have in the organization. And we also, going back to what people want to do, we heard from contributors that some of them were interested in mentoring people for specific roles or specific kind of projects or things like that. And so we wanted to be able to highlight some of those efforts. And then finally, we also wanted to showcase the growth and maturity of the project. We have a lot of very consistent contributors. We have people who work on Rust in their free time, who are paid to work on Rust, and really just showing off how many people give back to the project or contribute to the project in various ways. I think it's a really big sign of maturity for the project, and really speaks to some of the stuff that we're doing. So next slide. So this process was kind of come up informally and on the fly and wasn't really given a whole lot of thought ahead of time. So while this, I think, has worked well for us, there's definitely, tweaks and things that could probably be done to streamline or improve it. But the very first thing we did was just open a thread on the T-Compiler Zulip channel to literally just ask people to spitball ideas for what could go on the roadmap and kind of see what people might be interested in working on, or what they thought, would be a good thing to work on. And then separately, Felix and I wrote up kind of lists based on some of the feedback in that thread, based on things that we knew people in the project were already working on, or that they were very interested in working on, or things that we thought could, would be great to tackle if we had the resources or whatever. So then after we did that separately, we came together and we consolidated those lists into one document. And one of the kind of really interesting things that emerged at this point was a very clear distinction between a list of things that we felt like we could achieve this year very concretely. And we decided to call those things initiatives. And then there was another list of things that we both thought would be excellent if we could get done. But as it is now, we don't really know that those things will get done this year. And so we called those things aspirations. So after that, we went back to the compiler team and the compiler team contributors. We sent some emails with links to the consolidated document and scheduled one of our Friday design meetings just to go over the document and read it and talk about it with people, and see what the feedback was, whether we were on the mark or had missed things, and even just PM'd people to make sure we got feedback from everybody on the team and there wasn't something important we were missing or whatever. And then finally, the result of that was kind of distilled down a little bit and reworded for more general consumption, and is going up on the Inside Rust blog tomorrow, which is very exciting. Next slide. Some of the takeaways we learned from doing this, it always takes longer than you think it is going to. Like every step of this took longer than we kind of thought it would, or maybe we were just hoping it would. In the end, I think it was totally worth it, but it is a time investment to do something like this. Related to that, we set deadlines for various pieces, and I think that was really helpful as a forcing function to make sure that stuff got done. But it was also important to kind of remember that a lot of these were kind of self-imposed. And so if there was some really important reason to delay something or whatever, then we could do that, and not to get too fixated on hitting every single deadline, exactly. And then I think one of the really interesting things that came out of this for me was the outcome of just having people talk about what they hoped or what they wanted or planned to do this year was extremely valuable. There were multiple areas where Felix and I thought it would be really great if we could do this, and maybe even one or both of us were interested in doing something there. We just didn't know, would we have enough people to make it an initiative instead of an aspiration. And debugging in particular was one area where we thought, we really need to do something. The survey results Nick mentioned earlier, debugging was one of the pieces that really stuck out from that as currently very lacking to people in the community. And it turned out that there were a lot of people on the team that were interested in contributing here. So we're actually spinning up a debugging working group this year to make some progress on that. Next slide. So kind of a sneak peek as to what's in the blog post. There were three main themes, I should say, that we identified for 2022. One was fulfilling Rust's promise, which is really kind of about identifying the gaps between expectations and reality for the three main pillars we have on our site: performance, reliability, and productivity, and then addressing those. The developer delight, we wanted to answer the question, what would delight Rust developers, and not just meet the bar for where things should be, but surpass that. And then finally, contributor workflow to the compiler specifically. So this is typically improvements to the technology or the tooling or the infrastructure, or whatever, that benefit people maintaining and extending the compiler itself. Next slide. And so between those three themes and the things that we concretely thought we could do, the initiatives, and the things that we hope or would love to do if we had infinite resources, but we're not sure that we can actually get done this year, we have these lists of topics. So addressing issues of unsoundness in the compiler, we think we can make concrete progress on that this year. We think we can make concrete progress on various pieces of async Rust, like implementations for async functions and traits, and some of the other enhancements around just using async Rust. We think we can make a lot of great progress on debugging. We think there are some pieces there that are probably going to be more aspirational in nature, really deep integrations with GDB and LLDB and WinDBG and Vision Studio, and the multitude of debuggers out there is, we would love to have that, but we think that's probably aspirational this year. This year, we would really like to focus more on fixing some of the kind of fundamental issues and making things have a really solid foundation there. We think that we can make progress on compiler throughput and improve things there. Again, there's such an open-ended area there that some of that is aspirational, but we think we can make concrete progress there. Expressiveness is really kind of about the gap between things that have been approved in Rust the language and things that are stable on a stable compiler, or things that are not implemented at all currently in the compiler. And there's a lot of those, so we think we can make progress in some of those things, and other things are probably going to be in the future. And then finally, librarification is really about splitting out pieces of the compiler so that they can be reused across other projects. This impacts things like using Mirror for formal verification, or even some of the things within the project like Miri and address sanitizers and things like that. And then finally, the things that we would love to do, but we think are probably, at least currently, not going to get done this year, addressing the backlog p-high issues. We have plans to try to triage them, but I don't know that we will actually make progress in resolving, a vast majority of them or something. We would love to have, improvements to how the compiler team runs organizationally or procedurally. We would love to see more work on some of our alternative backends, like CodeGen GCC and CodeGen crane lifts. And I think there probably will be things that happen there this year, but I don't know that we will be able to drive those, to completion on a stable compiler this year, at least with the current resourcing. And then finally, diagnostics. There will certainly be improvements that land to diagnostics this year, but I don't know that it's going to be a big push on diagnostics this year, at least currently. So
I just want to jump in quickly here because watching Leslie talk, there was one thing here that I want to stress. Anything that you want to add to the compiler is in some ways an aspiration. These concrete aspirations were chosen particularly because while we don't have the resources today to do them based on what people's timelines are, they do have owners. These are things where if someone were to show up and say, I want to help with this, we do have a plan in terms of there's a person named who says, yes, I am willing to help mentor somebody with getting started in this area. So it's really important to me that we've teased out the aspirations as things it's deliberately meant to be a way to invite people to come in and help us succeed this year. And the other detail there is a number of these items in this table are specifically ones that they're meant to be things where you don't have to have a lot of expertise in the compiler source code itself to make big impact. You'll see it spelled out in the blog post itself, but I want to stress it here since we have such a mix of people in this audience. I want to stress this. There's items on here such as the team operations item, where there's big bullet points for things that we hypothetically do not need necessarily someone who's got compiler expertise to deliver in other ways. The examples there are things like automated test reduction tooling is an area that I think we could make big strides on, and you don't have to be a compiler expert to do that. And our performance profile, our what's the word? Our benchmarking suite. Yeah, our performance benchmarking infrastructure has a lot of needs that don't require compiler expertise to deliver on. It just needs that a lot of us don't have expertise with, like web front end things.
Yeah. Thanks for adding that. I was trying to trim the chart down a little bit and cut off the owners and things, but there's more details on all of these things in the blog post. And as Felix said, there's also links to the people that own all of these certain areas. Some of these areas are split across concrete initiatives and aspirations. And so they have different owners, some of them for those different things, but all of the details in the blog post is going out tomorrow. So that is the last slide. So I guess we can take questions if there's any questions.
All right, great. Yeah, so we have a few minutes for questions here. I'll wait to see if anything comes up in chat, but I'm not sure anybody has put their hand up just yet. Nico, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I didn't see any hands up, but I have a question. And thank you all. I second Remy here. I was thinking about sharing knowledge and plans. And I think the MCP process and so on has been great. But I'm realizing, like, as I watch some things go by that I, at least partly a function of just not having as much time as I would like to follow along in Zulip, don't really know like how we plan to re-architect here and so forth. Have you all thought about team mechanisms for kind of sharing knowledge beyond the MCP, like maybe reorganizing the Rusty lecture series and so forth? And I guess somewhat separately, would team organization be a kind of topic that would show up on this roadmap, or is it all technical topics?
So this the content of this document proposal was mainly focused on technical stuff. Like there's a point where I think I explicitly called out and some draft of it, like we're just focusing on technical stuff here, not social processes, etc. I don't have a good reason for why we chose to do that. It was just what I figured would be of interest to the larger audience. And as for the other question you asked about knowledge sharing, I'm curious, are you asking that about specifically about sharing knowledge across other teams, or are you meaning both sharing knowledge within the compiler team and across other teams?
I meant more like amongst compiler team, and sort of, I guess the somewhat larger like compiler team and adjacent people who hack on the compiler. Like I would love to hear more about the plans around here stuff, specifically. But I just think that it would be great to try to have some organized effort to have more conversations like that happening. And I'm wondering if that's something that could be a good working group. I don't think it should all fall on you two. It would be better if we could make it more independent.
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think it sort of falls in a little bit with some of the team operations things. I think there were a few non-technical things that did get called out there. And that would probably be a good fit for some of that.
Like another related topic would be like Rust Dev Guide based initiatives and so on. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Any other questions since I'm trying to maintain the list?
There was a question in the chat from Frederick Dens. Is there an overview of what's concretely planned in the short term for the improvement categories which have concrete initiatives? I think the best answer there is sometimes. Like I think that the text of the blog post, which you'll see when it gets posted, it does spell out some amount of specific things for the different concrete initiatives in terms of spelling out what particular owners are planning to deliver. But I will admit, I think it didn't get into as much detail as some people would hope in terms of, I've definitely had some people who read the document and gave me feedback. This thing that you listed here is like a multi-year initiative. What are the actual goals and milestones that you're going to be delivering on this year? And my reaction is to say, well, this document's already late as it is. I don't want to go back around and try to get like that level of detail, but like Wesley said, in terms of future iterations of the document, I think it would be good to get that level of concrete detail into the document on the first go around if we can do it.
All right. It looks like we're at the end of questions. I'll give it another few seconds here. All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Wesley and Felix, for the talk here. I'm just gonna pull us back over to the agenda. We're almost at the top of the hour, and so I'm just gonna leave it open for another few minutes if there's any announcements people would like to make. But if not, that is all good.
I have an announcement. So Doc Jones and I have been discussing, I don't know if any of you saw, but there was a paper that came out a while ago about doing analysis of non-coding roles in open source communities, and they analyzed like NPM contributor data and other stuff. And Doc Jones and I have been discussing some with the authors of that paper who are really interested in applying their kind of metric analysis to Rust. And one of the things I was hoping for is that if people are on this call who would like to chat about that, maybe we can do it in the social hour. If there are like kinds of analyses you would like to do to look at what kind of projects are active, other kinds of data that you, or just or who knows what piece of code best or things. If there are questions that you feel like you could possibly answer, I'd like to chat about them during social hour. So that's the announcement.
Great, thanks, Nico. Anything else from anybody? Yes, Josh, I'll hand it over to you.
Just a mention that instrument coverage is going to be stable soon, and I wanted to invite people to, if you have performance sensitive Rust code, you will soon be able to do instrumentation based code coverage on your code, try to figure out more about what's going on with it. I'm looking at doing some of the same stuff with profiling. And more generally, there's a number of efforts going on right now to try to stabilize some of our long-standing, this has been unstable forever kinds of features, like Cargo's timing option or strip or 20 other things. And I would encourage people who are keeping an eye on particular features that they think will never be stable and who have kind of given up hope on them being stabilized to revive that discussion and like, hey, I'm still interested in this. What can I do to help with this? What's the blocker for it to be stabilized? Sometimes it's easier than you might think. And it's a really rewarding activity. People care a lot about a feature showing up in stable.
All right, and then I'm just taking a look at chat. Wesley, I can't see the characters that you put in because they're showing up as blocks for me, but I assume that was not putting your hand up, but just in
Sorry, those were just celebrations for
Okay.
instrument coverage being stabilized.
Perfect. Yes, good reason for excitement. All right. So in that case, I will close off the CTCFT. We'll hop over to the social hour. So thank you everybody for coming out to the February CTCFT. And we will
I'm
be
muted,
here.
That's why. Wait, Forrest, wait. I
Yes.
just thought of one other thing.
All right.
We were saying we're going to do a longer talk about this next time, but we're looking for ways to grow the set of, or to incorporate suggestions on what kinds of things would be great to cover during the CTCFT. So if you have ideas of things you'd like to hear us talk, I just want to add that you can throw them in Zulip for now, and in the next meeting, I think we'll be talking some about a more organized approach we plan to take.
Indeed, yes. Organization would be very nice for our background setup of the CTCFTs. All right, so yeah, we'll hop over to the social hour, and we will see you next month.
Don't forget to stop the recording.
All right, did it stop? Oh, is this working on stopping?
I don't know if it stopped.